Get ready, because this could be one of the greatest game-changing presentations you've ever seen. One that could impact the country, the planet, the future, and your entire way of life. It's like a remedial civics lesson from some weird substitute summer school teacher. Is this guy even qualified? Absolutely. But not exactly. But don't worry about that. This isn't a test. We're just going to learn and have fun today. Hello, I'm TV's Blake Wally, and I have a question for you. Is it time for us to replace the Constitution? Is it old and boring? More and more people seem to think so. Maybe we should make a switch to socialism. Everyone else is doing it. The United States, it's more like the divided states, and it makes you wonder how we ever became united in the first place. Well, it wasn't easy, and it's a long story, but it's a really good one of the greatest in history, and its importance cannot be overstated these days, because the future of this country and planet may depend on knowing this information. So strap yourselves in, because we're about to take an adventure through time. Welcome to the history lesson that you never knew you needed. Now, let's begin. Now, however you feel about it, the Constitution is so far the most important document for freedom in all of human history. Now, there was the Magna Carta of 1215, which reluctantly allowed the underlings some basic human rights. But then it took another 500 years of dark ages for the next great advance for mankind. There was a Renaissance and Revolution era with a new land discovered across the Atlantic. A new beginning, a new opportunity, a new constitution. A set of laws that guaranteed human freedom on a completely new level. Here's some backstory. Now, a lot of settlers came over from Great Britain for freedom because they had no hope there or anywhere else. So they were willing to travel across the Atlantic and fend for themselves on a strange land. Now, eventually the Americans that came from Britain were about 20% richer and only paid about a quarter of the taxes. However, the monarchy didn't like that and wanted more money, so they started taxing more and more things. Now, the Americans didn't like paying more for some king and parliament that were 3,000 miles away. So they had little rebellions, and the smaller rebellions turned into bigger ones, eventually leading to the Boston Tea Party. The king didn't like that, so he sent 4,000 troops from England to Boston, where they became more authoritarian and abusive. Now, the occupation led to more anger and resentment to the royals, and that included with the Boston Massacre. So was it time to rise up against the monarchy that was ruining the colonies now? Well, that couldn't be discussed in public, however, because these were colonies of the crown, and that would have been treason. Now, eventually there were enough of these secret messages that turned into secret meetings, and soon we had a Continental Congress. And they came up with an impressive and extremely thorough list of grievances that they sent to the king, which we know today as the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Now, the colonists, they wanted to be free to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Also saying that their rights came from God, not government, not a king of some royal bloodline. This was by the people, for the people, all men are created equal, freedom. But King George was not pleased, so we had the Revolutionary War. We barely pulled it off. It may have been a miracle, but our forefathers were able to pull off the impossible. It's one of the most amazing underdog stories in human history. However, we will not have time to cover any more of that in this presentation, but the American spirit persevered and we won the war. Now, the whole independence thing was great for a while, but after several years we were having issues. There were different states with disagreements over policies and commerce and stuff, so we tried out the Articles of Confederation for a while, but that had its limitations. So there was a national crisis brewing, and it was time to, in effect, unite the states. Now, some thought we needed a big national, federal government too. Now, if the states were too divided and different, the country might dissolve and be reabsorbed by Great Britain one by one. In effect, we would have fought the entire Revolutionary War for nothing. We may have won our independence, but the British were still powerful. America really had no formal government. It was just a group of rogue states squabbling with each other over trade, taxes, and treaties, etc. So they set up a couple of constitutional conventions in Philadelphia, with representatives from all 13 colonies invited. Now, James Madison was one of the architects and masterminds to set this new government for the people, and he brought along George Washington because he was the man that the people could get behind, the soul of the republic. Also reunited with Benjamin Franklin, visionary genius and mentor. Now, they were retired American heroes, but very eager to participate. Now, specify the importance of this convention, because if it fails, America fails and mankind fails. So the forefathers were well educated and understood the different forms of government from around the world, past and modern examples full of pros and cons to come up with various ideas. So you had all these men meeting by day, dining by night, negotiating over glasses of wine and debating what the new government should be like. So there was a lot of diversity of opinions about religion and culture in those times, and it was challenged how best to design a government that works for everybody. And after much deliberation, a republic was chosen over democracy and, say, despotism or monarchy or what have you. Now, democracy, everybody could vote, but that could also be dangerous. You have, say, two wolves and a sheep that are voting on what to have for dinner. But in a republic, there would be guaranteed rights, checks, and balances. And then people would just choose their representatives to be their voice. Anyway, they spent considerable time coming up with all the best ways they could think of and agree upon to create a government that best served its people. So this was the summer of 1787, an almost unheard of opportunity to sit down with some of the finest minds in the country. Now, it sounds innocent enough, but that would normally be considered a treasonous coup in most countries. Now, they set this up with the principles of the Constitution on natural law. And basically, that's the theory, is that humans possess an intrinsic sense of right and wrong that governs our reasoning and behavior. The concepts of natural law are ancient. They come from Plato, Aristotle, and even the Bible. This wasn't new exactly, mostly a repackaged core of ideas in a new way. But the key component is that your rights came from God, spirit, soul, source, not from some king far away. Like rights? Do you have the king's permission? No, this was on common sense, right and wrong, and this was the special foundation of our system. When the forefathers finished finalizing all of the finer details, they designed the master copy that we still have today. Now, it's not actually hemp, but it's made with stretched animal skin, usually a sheep. It's stretched, it's scraped, and kind of strange and gross, but that's what they used in those days for documents of high importance because they were built to last. Now, the Constitution also used a special ink with a high iron content that was also meant to last. We can see that from the Declaration faded a bit faster. So this document was well preserved, but still old-fashioned tech. It wasn't, typed on a PC or a Mac. It was actually written by a man named Jacob Shallis, who was paid $30 for his beautiful calligraphy. And after finishing, the Constitution was a glorious, priceless historical artifact. But it was created in an entirely different era and could maybe use a 21st century makeover. Now, the new generation kind of needs something simplified and shiny to get excited about. We don't write with fountain pens, we have fonts. And they don't even teach cursive in schools anymore. Will anyone in the future even be able to read it? Now, obviously, it's old and rather boring, especially by today's standards. Got outdated words, lots of legal details and clauses, and of course the cursive. But regardless, it is critically important that people understand its significance. It's the key to our entire way of life and for the future generations that come after us. Now, they say it takes about 30 to 40 minutes to read through the entire Constitution, but that's boring. So I'm going to skip over all the legal fluff and focus on the good stuff. So when you boil it all down, the Constitution is pretty much just an introduction paragraph with 7 sections full of instructions. Now, with all that out of the way, The law of the land is a pretty simple, straightforward, and common sense document. So we'll start with the preamble paragraph, which says, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." That means future generations. "Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So it was not some, hey, we are your new rulers now. Obey us because we said so. No, this truly was a government by the people and for the people to ensure our perpetual prosperity forever if it could. So nowadays, if we wanted to give this a makeover, we could simplify this paragraph and just write this. "By order of this document, we the people will unite and work together for peace, justice, defense, liberty, and well-being for ourselves and for future generations." Nice and easy. Now let's get to the articles. There are 7, and the first 3 are about the 3 branches of government. So we have number 1, the legislative branch. That would be Congress. It consists of a House and a Senate. You have the lower chamber, that's the representatives, and they're proportionate to the population, and they're elected every 2 years. You have the upper chamber, that's the senators, exactly 2 per state, and they're elected every 6 years. And this apparently was one of the most contentious issues at the convention, was that whole balance of power, because you had small states like Delaware or Rhode Island that could be getting pushed around by the larger states like Virginia. Now, not every one of the drafters were thrilled about this, but compromise became the theme of the convention. Next, the Congress had financial functions. That's basically the power to coin money, tax, to pay debts. They also had security functions, the power to regulate and govern military forces and militias for defense and to declare war and make rules of war. They also had their domestic functions, that would be to provide for naturalization, general welfare if needed, post offices, roads, etc. Next, we have the second article, that would be the executive branch, the president and the vice president. Now, the inaugural oath is specified to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. That's their main job. Now, the president is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces and state militias when they are mobilized. It also makes treaties with the advice and consent of 2/3 quorum of the Senate. They see that the laws are faithfully executed, though he or she may grant reprieves and pardons except regarding congressional impeachment of himself or herself or other federal officers. Now, the president reports to Congress on the State of the Union and recommends necessary and expedient national measures. The president may convene and adjourn Congress under special circumstances. Now, it apparently took 64 votes to decide on the best way for the people to vote for the president. And they decided that the best way would be with delegates via the Electoral College. It was the most fair, secure, and balanced approach. Now, a lot of thought was put into that system, and a lot of thought should be put in before we throw it out for one big, oversimplified, popular vote for the entire country. Now, number 3, the third article, is the judicial branch. Now, there shall be one court called the Supreme Court. Later, it consisted of 9 judges. They determine the kinds of cases that the court takes as original jurisdiction, and then Congress can create lower courts and an appeals process. Congress enacts laws defining crimes and providing for punishment. They protect the right to trial by jury in all criminal cases, and they define the crime of treason. They have the authority to interpret and apply the law to a particular case. Also included is the power to punish, sentence, and direct future action to resolve conflicts. And the Constitution, of course, is the supreme law of the land. So those are your 3 branches. Now we have the 4th article, is basically the relationship of the states to other states and to the whole, that would be the federal government. Now the Fed guarantees each state as its own republic. The Fed protection of each state also from invasion or domestic violence. States must respect the laws of other states. and fugitives cannot seek refuge in another state if called for by the governor. And there's also rules and procedures to create new states. We had another 37 added over the time as we traveled west. Now that brings us to the 5th article, and that would be describing how new laws can be added to the Constitution. That would be called the amendments. Now, to make those, you need 2/3 of the House and Senate approval, also 3/4 of all the states to approve. And number 6 article is the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that government officials need to swear an oath to support the Constitution. Finally, the 7th and final article, yes, is the state representatives that wrote this agree to validate the Constitution. So all of the people that were there coming up with this document, they ratified it unanimously on September 17th, 1787. Now, that did not include the Bill of Rights. Some of those individual states had them, but they didn't have one for the entire country, but that was written in later. So they put this whole thing together, sent it around the country, everybody loved it, and then they decided, okay, let's add the Bill of Rights, call it a day. But things took a lot more time. They didn't have email and such back then. So we did have the Bill of Rights, came in later, and we'll go through that list of 10, starting with number 1, what they all considered the most important. That would be the freedom of speech, religion, and the press. So the most important of all was an experiment that had never been done before. It was the right to speak or write whatever you wanted, as long as you weren't calling for violence. Now, you weren't allowed to criticize leadership in other countries. Yeah, the Pope or the King, it was unheard of. So, choose your own religion? Yeah, right. Depends on which country you live in, but not very many. And of course, there's no real independent media to report on whatever they wanted. Yeah, good luck with that. So, number 2 was the right to bear arms, considered maybe the most contentious issue. How do we do a redo on something like that? Now, like it or not, it's probably the most effective way to guarantee freedom. Now, the forefathers didn't really believe in keeping standing armies, but they wanted protection from other armies through militias. Now, without any guns, we would still belong to the British. We'd still be a colony. We would be paying even more insane amounts of taxes so we could, shower our royalty with luxuries while they lecture us on our American lifestyle. Now, it's better to live in a world where everyone is armed than no one at all except the bad guys and or authorities. Unfortunately, arms are still a necessary evil in a world with evil in it. That's usually a recipe for disaster, and history is full of many examples of why this eventually turns into a bad idea, an unarmed population. Because when the wrong people get into power, they can be very difficult and costly to get rid of. Take a look at Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot, Hitler, Castro. People tend to be disarmed in dictatorships, and unarmed populations tend to get bullied around by police a bit and live under total tyranny. Now you could say almost anything you wanted, and you had the right to defend yourself. People in power just couldn't have you dragged away and locked up or killed. The Second Amendment was a brilliant built-in safeguard against tyranny, a new balance of power between the people and the government. Now, things could be done to prevent wrong people from, having these weapons, but this right is far too important to really be infringed upon. Now we have the Third Amendment, quartering soldiers. Now, it doesn't really apply today, but it was a key component of why we had our war with England in the first place. Now, back in those days, if they had the soldiers over here and there was no barracks available or whatever, or tents or lodging, the British Army would just use your home as a bed and breakfast. It didn't go over very well with a lot of the colonists, and so they wrote that in as number 3. Now, number 4 was protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. So the government officers can't just come into your house and start digging through your belongings without a warrant. Number 5 was protection for rights of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. So there you have the I plead the 5th. So you have no forcing people to answer for major crimes until they've had their day in court. This also leads to the whole innocent until proven guilty. Now, the Sixth Amendment was about criminal rights, for a speedy public trial, impartial jury, counsel provided if needed, clear accusation information with witness testimony for both sides, not some kangaroo court by the king. So the Seventh Amendment was for rights in civil cases. It's kind of an outdated, but you could probably incorporate it with number 6. The Eighth Amendment was forbidding excessive bails, fines, and punishments. This might be a good reason to outlaw, say, private prisons, which are incentivized to hold more people. Maybe a case for ending the drug war and bringing some, real rehabilitation and education, training for the jails, maybe not punishing inmates into oblivion and restricted on their opportunities after. Prisons should mostly be reserved for violent and irrational criminals. Now, the Ninth Amendment was basically addressing rights not specifically enumerated by the Constitution. What it's really saying is that if the rights not mentioned in there belong to the people over the government. And the 10th Amendment was to say that unless explicitly outlined in the Constitution, the Fed will cede power to the states or citizens to determine law and order. That means that the people have the power at the top, then the states, and then the Fed. Kind of the opposite of what happens these days with the powerful Fed ruling over the states and the people. Now, the original document was signed September 17, 1787, but this was the updated version with the Bill of Rights put in, and that was April 29, 1789, when George Washington was also sworn in as the first president, who made the oath that number 1 was to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, we were officially a real country on the world stage. Now, it wasn't perfect, and neither were our forefathers, but it was a brilliant and beautiful document that gave us the finest blueprint for good government on the planet, with freedom on a level never imagined. And just like that, we became the greatest country in the world overnight. We inspired the entire planet, the land of opportunity. Everybody wanted to come here and experience the American dream. Now, of note, this was a very small government, really. There's no massive military, no central bank, none of these departments. A very different era. It's difficult to compare today. Apparently, even the forefathers didn't believe in the parties. Instead of kind of envisioning this congressional process working differently, but with two separate sides. So for an example, an important issue comes up. One side comes up with the ideas for the solution. The other side calculates how much those ideas would cost and how much we would have to raise the taxes. Then they would debate the pros and cons. The public could chime in if it wants. Hey, call your representative now. Now, sometimes the system works like that, but often it's really about party affiliation. It's playing politics, and it's about who controls the majority in Congress. But the goal should be to have practical, beneficial programs and services that improve our lives at a reasonable cost. The objective should always be to reduce the size and scope of government, fewer taxes. However, the federal government is never intended to have as much power as it does now. It's big, bloated, corrupt, with career politicians selling out the people. It's easy to grow, but it's difficult to scale back. There's no term limits, backroom deals, insider trading, super PACs, dark money, these obnoxiously overloaded bills and packages that are stuffed full of pork and special interests, and they don't have time to be read by people. Case in point, we've got this latest, quote, infrastructure bill. It's 2,700 pages. It's voted on, but we don't really entirely know what's in it. Only a fraction of the percentage goes to the programs that we think it will, and then the rest is, special interests and kickbacks. And then, of course, we've got the military-industrial complex, the deep state, the oligarchy, the corporatocracy, the technocracy, the kleptocracy. It's not how the founders envisioned this process working. Now we're almost like Britain used to be in many ways, ironically. A formidable empire and world superpower. So we rebelled, we won our independence, we went our own way, but then we started turning into our parents in the end. But this was the beginning. And of course, this isn't the Constitution's not a Google Doc, but they still left this preserved physical document open for important extra items and things to be added in later. You just had to, find yourself another fine piece of parchment with the premium iron ink, and then you follow the instructions outlined in Article 5, the amendment section. So over the next couple hundred years, new problems face the country, and they've added new amendments ever since, and we will start with those. Number 11 was actually written just 6 years after. That was the first new amendment added, and that would be the judicial jurisdiction procedures. It was restricting cases involving citizens suing states from another state or country. Now, it's a rare occurrence, but I guess it happened enough back in those days to merit a new amendment, which they could probably just incorporate into number 6. Now, it really had to do with a couple cases, say a man in South Carolina that was suing Georgia for money that he thought it owed him, and you had another case of a British soldier who was suing to get his stolen stuff back, so they added a new amendment. Now, the 12th Amendment came into play a few years later. It was really kind of from the 1800 election. So it was emergency presidential procedures. It's rarely in play, but it has happened a few times. Also happened in 1824. So it was also so much for avoiding the whole political parties idea. Originally, they set it up to have the top vote would be for the president, and then the number 2 vote getter would be the vice president. It didn't quite work out the way they hoped it would, and nowadays we just have political tickets for each side. It also deals with the problems of what if one of the candidates doesn't receive the required amount of electoral votes. Now, it could definitely be in play, especially when you have multiple presidential candidates from different parties. And if that's ever inconclusive, the House of Representatives will make the decision to choose the president. And of course, this has been modified and superseded to some extent by the 20th Amendment, although it's still valid. All right, and that brings us to the 13th Amendment. That would be abolishing slavery. Now, to note, that was a hot topic during the drafting of the Constitution, because many of the northern states didn't use slave labor, and many people were appalled to be associated with it. Now, the forefathers and early American settlers take a lot of flack for it, but it's not like they invented slavery. It's not like they went over kidnapping people from their high-paying jobs in 17th century Africa, pulling kids out of universities to take permanent unpaid internships on tobacco plantations or anything. So, risky joking aside, it doesn't make it okay. It's not fair. It's not justified. There was a very different world back then, but there's no doubt that it put a stain on our history. So these people would come over. If you can see the picture there, this is part of that whole 1619 origin where this happened. People were being sold, do work, basically for room and board. So they tried to undo this. In 1863, on the first day, January 1st, Abraham Lincoln made his Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that all slaves would be free and forever free, and a lot of them ended up actually joining the Union Army. But now all people have been free for over 150 years now. And that was from December 6th of 1865, the 13th Amendment. And now today, African Americans make up at least, 12, 13% of the population. And without the slavery, that would be much less. Now, there were generations of misery and struggle, but the descendants are probably living better today. Now, however they arrived here, we wouldn't have this country today without these uncomfortable chapters in our history. They helped build this country when we couldn't afford to. They fought in the Civil and Revolutionary War because a lot of the white kids stayed at home. There was no draft. You couldn't force people to go fight. Some of the black, they fought in the war because they were poor or they wanted to win their freedom. Some did, and unfortunately, some were double-crossed. Slave owners, freaked out about giving them weapons. You were kind of going to turn on them, start slave rebellions. And you see the importance of the Second Amendment again. But without the great black people, there is no America for anyone, period. And nowadays, in modern America, diversity has been our greatest strength over other countries in the world. Anyway, it was a very complicated issue at the time, and it wasn't going to be solved over the weekend in the summer of 1787. However, compromise was the key. Not every state and representative got everything they wanted during the convention. Like, one side would say, hey, that's really messed up that you're still allowing the use of slave labor. The other person would say, hey, you know what, maybe you're right, but we can't just outlaw slavery in the entire South overnight just to get this union started. So it took several more decades and a civil war, but we finally began to right this terrible wrong. That brings us to the 14th Amendment. That would be the rights of citizenship. That was done just a few years later in 1868, saying that if you're born or naturalized, you're a free slave, you're an immigrant, here you are a citizen of the United States in the state you reside, and that no state may override your U.S. rights, life, liberty, or law without due process of law. And no citizen can run for office if they've been involved in an insurrection or giving aid and comfort to the enemy. More specifically applies to elected officials that have already been sworn an oath. Of course, was also used against Donald Trump in his second impeachment. The 15th Amendment, written 2 years after that, was about voting rights. You probably included in number 14, basically saying you can vote, you can't be denied by race, color, or if you're a former felon. The 16th Amendment, another very controversial one, that would be for the federal income tax that was put in 1913. That granted the Fed, the Congress, the power to collect taxes without apportionment. Now, that was serious stuff. Now the Fed wanted access to your finances. This was put in by Woodrow Wilson and his big banking pals that got him elected. And they slipped it in through Congress over a Christmas session. That began the whole taxing of your labor, which was pretty unconstitutional anyway, and it also led to the creation of the Federal Reserve Central Bank along with the IRS. Now, the effects didn't hit right away, but they certainly would after World War I. It's a story for another day. But it brings us to the 17th Amendment. That would be the election of senators. That was also done in 1913, and that just says that there's going to be 2 per state, and that it would have 6-year terms. You could probably just add that to the first article. This also has procedures there to handle vacancies. Now, the 18th Amendment didn't last long. That was alcohol prohibition, done in 1919. Canceled out. Maybe a good case for ending the drug war someday, too. Next, we have the 19th Amendment. That would be voting rights for women. It's 1920. I don't know if the country kind of finally sobered up and went, hey, this isn't right. And they righted this wrong. Now, women had the same kind of rights as men and could finally vote. Then we had the 20th Amendment. That would be terms for president and Congress. Is also kind of known as the lame duck amendment. It closed the gap, basically, of the amount of time between the election and representatives entering office, kind of get everybody on the same page at the same time. Also outlined some of the emergency presidential procedures in case of deaths, disputes, contested elections, perhaps as well. The 21st Amendment was also put up in 1933, and that repealed number 18, the failed prohibition policy. Also, as interesting as the power of the juror rights. The reason this failed is because a lot of people wouldn't convict people for crimes they didn't believe to be justified. So just because it was a law, you'd go to the jury, and the jury would say, you know what, maybe that's the law of the land, but I don't agree with it, so not guilty. So eventually they just said, you know what, this is failing trying to enforce that, and they got rid of it, but officially in 1933. Leads us to the 22nd Amendment. That would be for presidential term limits. and that was put in 1951. I guess you could probably combine that with 20 or something else. Basically saying that the president cannot serve more than 2 terms. This really came into play because of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served 4 terms during World War II. So maybe that could also lead to term limits for Congress, maybe even the Supreme Court. We'll see. The 23rd Amendment was really just about the D.C. citizens having their own electoral allotment, as they called it. That was in 1961. So Washington, D.C. was this kind of federal area, and it allowed the people who live in D.C. to actually vote for president because they weren't really a state. And people had to live in a state to vote, but after 61, D.C. citizens could vote for president. 24th Amendment was voting rights protected from taxes. This was 1964. There were still 5 states that levied poll taxes to vote, which really kind of targeted the poor, especially minorities. It was basically a racist policy. It made it so some people literally couldn't afford to vote. The 25th Amendment was a procedure in the hierarchy if something happens to the president. This was done in 1967 after the assassination of JFK. So this outlines it if there's ever a resignation, a death, or maybe the president is incompetent, they're mentally unfit, and that outlines the procedures on what happens next, who succeeds. Now, number 26 was voting rights extending to 18 years old. This was put in 1971. Again, it's probably something they could add to the 14th Amendment if this was a Google Doc. Now, number 27, that's the final one. It was actually done in 1992. And that says that you cannot change the pay of members of Congress midterm. You could probably add that on number 20. This was actually part of the original proposed Bill of Rights, but was not ratified at the time and officially amended much later in 1992. Anyway, this whole document has really served us very well over 240 years and counting, and could keep going on as long as it needs to. You know, most form of government is pretty easy and lazy. You know, we make the rules, you follow them because we said so. We own the police, the judges, the media. We have you surveilled. You're not allowed to criticize us, and no, you're not allowed to own firearms or weapons of any kind. Now, republics and democracies are difficult because it takes a lot more work and for good people to be involved in paying attention. Now, the forefathers put the best one together that's ever been done before or since. Now, it sure does take its share of criticism, though, like it's, standing in the way of some magical socialist utopia waiting for us. But basically, it was just the rights from God, the Spirit, and basic common sense. So, how does the original philosophy and spirit of this incredible historical document compare and translate to the 21st century? To say, the current administration and the modern-day Democratic Party? Well, the Bill of Rights would be more of an outdated obstacle at this point. One to be replaced with more, forward-thinking programs like UN Agenda 2030, along with some suggestions from their allies with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the First Amendment, there'd be all the social media censorship, of course, that we have now with the shadow banning, independent fact checkers, misinformation labels. They even want to intercept text messages. It's going to be the social justice, the cancel culture, social credit scores. Of course, they've also shut down their loudest critic in President Trump. Imagine, the power of big tech to ban and censor him from every major platform. Unelected bureaucrats. So the President of the United States has no freedom of speech in his own country. Even dictators in other countries were surprised about that. Now, as far as the Second Amendment goes, the current administration would take everyone's guns in about 2 seconds if they could. Throw them in that van and take them away. The Fourth Amendment, you've got the door-to-door vaccine insanity that's going on. We could take a look at, say, the 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th Amendment. Take a look at the political prisoners from January 6th. Was it really an insurrection just because they say so? Now, however you feel, these guys were mostly non-violent and were let into the building. Many are currently being held without charges and still have no trial set yet. They're kept in solitary, they're beaten and tortured in some cases. Not for plotting, not for terrorism, not for conspiracy, not for violence. For what? Taking pictures and selfies? Regardless, citizens are innocent until proven guilty in this country. It's unacceptable, it's inhuman, and it's un-American in every way. Now for the last Bill of Rights, number 10. This administration would love to federalize everything, weaken the states, probably put us into 10 different districts. Then they could enforce their whole lockdown society with controlled media run by the state. Be micromanagement of an obedient population that complies with orders and asks for permission. Because you'll never get out of this lockdown. It doesn't matter if they go door to door and they force vaccinate everybody. There will always be another strain, another booster on the way, and there is no day when things will get back to normal. You're going to have your kids getting jabbed. They're going to be wearing their masks and quarantined in the classroom. You're going to have the education is really, dumbing them down with giant federal programs like Common Core while they push for the curriculum to be changed to the 1619 Project or critical race theory. Then they can call our forefathers racists and white supremacists. And of course, they're going to continue to make their push for socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarianism, tyranny. Giving more money and power and control to the government is historically not a good idea. Authoritarians also have a reputation for cheating because they crave power, and the ends always justify the means. Now, if you asked me, say we're in a bar or something, I'd probably tell you that they most likely cheated this last election. Because there's no way that this guy received 81 million verified votes. I'd say the deep state, the real domestic terrorists, are probably colluding with the communist Chinese, hijack this great republic so it can be absorbed into world government. Could be said that these people performed a coup and stole the election so that they can continue with their agenda, putting in the perfect puppet, a confused and corrupt memory care patient. Meanwhile, they'll declare war on real Americans, the true patriots who care about truth, justice, and the American way. Then they're going to shut people up with the socials and go door to door to force vaccinate everyone and take your guns. Lockdown forever. Have you had the latest vaccine? Don't be fooled by the fancy suits that they're wearing. You're probably getting gaslighted by corporate propagandists. But I could be wrong. I guess we'll just have to finish these audits to know for sure. It would be nice if they would quit stalling the process, though. Acting suspicious like they're hiding something. Could they be afraid of getting, caught cheating the election? There's only one way to find out for sure. We can disagree on policy, but we have to agree on election integrity. Because if one side was willing to cheat and allowed to get away with it, there's no reason to think that there'll ever be another fair election again. Recounts are not enough, nor is taking them at their word for it. Because recounts are not audits. And here's the difference. You can have 30 apples and you can recount them and you still have 30 apples. But once you actually inspect them, you find that 5 are plastic, 4 are glass, and 3 are oranges painted to look like apples. So in all reality, you only have 18 apples. That, or you can, take them at their word for it. Why? Because they told us that it was the most secure election ever? That sounds like something that the people that stole it would say. No, what we need are thorough, transparent forensic auditing for every state immediately. Some people don't trust the cyber ninjas. Some people don't trust Dominion. So it's time for a showdown, once and for all, just to be sure, nothing personal. Because if we allow potentially stolen results to stand, I've already outlined their future plans for America. Whether it's the Project for the New American Century or Agenda 21, 2030, a New Green Deal, Chinese Century, 1984, Hunger Games eventually. Hey, give it about 20 years. So act now while we can, or it could be the last chance that we get. And history is full of examples of how this story is going to end. Because as we speak, they're trying to put new voting measures in to outlaw IDs, unlimited, unaccountable mail-in everything with no verified anything. They're going to keep stuffing that ballot box until they win. Now they want to set up federalized elections, of course using their shady private machinery. This country will be gone before you know it, and you'll never be able to vote it back in. So let's at least just get this one last great audit, forensic recount done while we have the chance. I think people have forgotten about the greatness of the Constitution. We take for granted what other people around the world can only dream about. And it's difficult to find this kind of guaranteed freedom anywhere else on the planet. So if we were to throw away the Bill of Rights, they're going to be really, really hard to get back. Rights are not a given. Freedom is not free. Is the power with the people, or is it with the ruling elite? Now, America is the only country right now that is standing in the way against a future full of global tyranny. Globalism is in opposition of the principles of the Constitution, no matter how nice and green it sounds. It is a road to a meticulously micromanaged New Age style feudalism where you will have nothing and be happy. But that's the world they want, ruling over the weak and unarmed peasants forever. But what would you do if it was your choice, today and going forward for future generations? Now, the Constitution might look old and outdated, but if we were to discard it, what are we going to replace it with? I think we should prefer to remain under those laws until we could come up with something better. But it wasn't meant to last forever, and maybe we could all work together in some way on our common goals. Something that could unite us all once again. We the people we deserve today. Create a new and improved Bill of Rights if we all wanted to. What would you like to add or subtract from it if you could? Keep the cornerstones. We could condense that whole list to about 10 of them again. Now, there's all kinds of interesting ideas for some cool future innovations. A new and improved and more efficient government for another presentation. I would just suggest, rethinking the size and the power of government. Again, the federal government is far bigger than the forefathers could have ever imagined. And it allows, maybe allows states more leeway to conduct their own affairs again. It's the United States. It's the states all united, not one big federal government ruling over everybody. It also makes for an interesting case studies if you have these different states improving government either way. They do their own things. We collect that data, see what works, where and why, instead of some top-bottom giant, federal incentivized programs. None of this, whole states taking money from the Fed for accepting their programs or some BS. Otherwise, I'd say another big objection is Amendment number 16, getting rid of the Federal Reserve System. This was not put in by the forefathers. Most of them did not like central banks, and they tried to warn us about this. It's not even federal. It's technically a private entity, and it's not the U.S. Treasury. It also gives capitalism a bad reputation because people confuse it with crony capitalism instead, or corporatism. Now, free market is still the best system yet. So they talk about having a financial reset. Hey, that'd be great, just in a different way. Replace it with something that works better for everybody. Then come up with a new and improved constitution built on the foundation of the old one to guide future generations until they come up with something better someday. The world and future are only limited by your imagination and practical application. For now, it's great to be an American. So let's not throw away this grand experiment just yet. Don't forget your history, your birthright. Knowledge is power. Thanks for listening, and may God bless America.